welcome to this week's MF-casted lunch. Today, I have the pleasure to present to you Marion Grau, our colleague, who has written or co-edited a book about constructive theology, which recently, I think, or just in the autumn or something, appeared. And we would love to hear a little more about this book, which, as I understand from Marion, tries to actually answer or suggest some answers to the question, what is constructive theology, which is also the title of the book. And this is, as I understand, a term that seemed to which is current and may replace or almost replace the more established term systematic theology, if I'm not mistaken. So I want to hear more about that. And before I give the word to Marion, I just repeat that your questions and comments after Marion's talk are most welcome, and please use the Q&A function or write your question in the chat, and I will moderate our conversation afterwards. So please, Marion, tell us about what constructive theology is.
Yeah, I'm going to share my presentation here. Good morning, everybody. It's another day of Corona restrictions and so forth. So if it's thank you for attending yet another Zoom meeting, which isn't always what we really want to do. But so thank you for allowing me to talk today and think with you about what may constructive theology be. So one of the ways in which one can address this is by asking a number of questions. Where and when do people start to talk about constructing theology? And what are the locations at which constructive theologies emerge then and now? And then also, and this is what we wanted to really do with the book, what are some of the commitments and methods that constructive theologians employ? I have tried throughout the book or for my own contributions, to avoid constructive theology as this thing, as if constructive theology was a person, but rather more what kinds of patterns, methods, and markers are people who work with or in constructive theologies using in their work. And what we've then done is edit this book. Jason Wyman is PhD graduate from Union Seminary in New York, and he's written a history on the term or the movement or whatever you want to call it of constructive theology that is also out. And so together with him, I collected a number of essays, 10 on the histories, methods, and perspectives. Was, as said earlier, published in 2020. If you're going to only remember one thing, this is the slide. Constructive theologies could be summarized by saying that those are theologies that are critical of power structures, that are intersectional, that are aiming to be interdisciplinary, that are, of course, contextual, and that have liberatory goals. This is the table of contents. I was going to just briefly look at it and just say that it's 3 different parts in which it's set up. Jason Wyman gives us the history. John Tatamanel talks about theology as theopatics, namely as a construction, as something humans do. Then there's my essay on methodological themes and patterns in constructive theology. In part 2, we have Heike Peckrun, who writes on the connection between body and knowing, epistemology, context, and hermeneutics. Shelley Rambo's chapter is on how constructive theologians have employed biblical stories. Holly Hildgardner writes on comparative theology and how a number of comparative theologians are doing their work as constructive theology. Then we have Anthony Reddy from Britain, United Kingdom, and his Black theology, constructive Black theology in Britain. In part 3, we have a North American contribution from Laurie Cassidy on indigenous peoples in the category of land as a category of theology. We have a Roman Catholic contribution, 2 Roman Catholic contributions here at the end. Lawrence Nwanko is a Nigerian Catholic priest who is talking about an African constructive theology as a response to prosperity theologies that are kind of have taken over his society. And Judith Gruber in Belgium, at Leuven, writes about Belgian colonial history as the evidence of ghosts and constructive theology as apologetic theology, coming to terms with the legacy of Belgian colonialism. So we've tried really as much as we could to expand the conversation. The Constructive Theological Work Group has its history is primarily from the United States, but people all across the world in various contexts and across various denominational or ecumenical contexts are using the methods of constructive theology or the themes and patterns. So I'm gonna just quickly go into my essay which lays out some of the markers. I'm gonna skip through some of this. Just quickly, here's material on what is the history. We can say that the first time it shows up in print in the United States in 1914, the term becomes solidified over time. In 1975, the work group on constructive theology is formed. If you were looking for the name Gordon Kaufman, it's right there. Bernard Loomer, Gordon Kaufman, David Tracy. So we have Catholic, Protestant participation from the beginning. 2010 onwards, the term is increasingly used as a replacement for the term systematic, a term many find, and many of my students in the United States found the term systematic alienating, abstract, or incomprehensible. And I would always get questions of what is the system in systematics, and it feels alienating, it feels scary, it's the class that we're most afraid of, I used to hear. So many theologians across the world do work that can be described as constructive theology, meaning it's contextual, there's critiques of injustice and abuses of power, it's politically engaged, and it realizes that it's doing that. It's fostering justice and equality. It's involved in ecological theologies, intersectional approaches, and global theologies. But you, of course, may be doing something that we would recognize or is fine. That's constructive theology, even though you'd never heard the term or are not necessarily considering yourself a constructive theologian. So it has to do with the kinds of questions people ask. And I'm going to skip over this one because I really want to stay within my time limit. One of the ways in which I've described it is that theology is actually really mythology, and in the sense that it has mythological and logical traditions that are engaged equally. So myth is not something that's strange, and theology also tries to reason through various different kinds of theological statements that exist throughout the history of Christianity. It's open to different genres and expressions, creation, stories, poetry, psalms, and tries to read them in respect of what kind of genre these belong to. It's one of the markers is that it comes out of a historical and is committed to historical and critical inquiries. The historical antecedents are historical and systematic theologies and contextual theologies throughout history. In the early 20th century, it emerges among a group of primarily European American theologians who consider critical inquiry into the history of faith the best work that they can do. And it also has impulses from liberation theologies of various kinds and ecological theologies. That's just is the sort of lineage. It's a metaphorical approach to theology. Sally McFaig famously has written Metaphorical Theology, which is one of the go-to texts to think about how does theological language work. There are impulses from the history of the via negativa, negative theology, the unsaying, that might be more appropriate mode of articulating theology than the sort of confident propositional language. Aquinas's and entis, the way in which whatever we can say about God is always more unlike God than whatever we can say. So there's a certain sense of humility, of the recognition of the limitations of theological language. And then the constructive theology then asks what kind of models, images, and metaphors are being used to describe divine and the divine and human world. Constructive theologians realize that they don't just, that's not something that's unique, of course, to constructive theology, but it's a sort of a clear statement that theology has political implications, whether or not you oppose or are in line with the governing political situation in which you find yourself in. Just to quickly go through that, there is a commitment to liberation. Theology must consider the suffering of people and other members of the creation community and so forth. So there is the connection and closeness to liberation theology, and many people that, you could be a liberation theologian and you could also be a constructive theologian. There's another marker that we could say that is the sense that it's polydox. There's an ecumenical, drawing from many traditions. People are also borrowing from other people's tradition. The term polydox tries to name that internally many traditions have multiple orthodoxies that might be equally valid. So it's trying to say these are accessible to us as options in the work of theology. It's contextual, as many people have argued. There is all theologies are contextual. But in addition, then, this term intercontextual, which I came across first actually at TF, and it has to do with the sense that various contextual theologies should talk to each other, inspire each other, because I could be doing my own contextual theology and it could be very, very narrow and say that other contextual theologies are not relevant to me. But this is also to say that, well, as a white American Christian, I don't have the same context as Black liberation theologians, but in order to come to a reckoning with racism, it is a theology that's relevant to me. So this is kind of sort of what is the theology that's relevant to me in my context, not just the one that comes out of my context. As much as possible, constructive theologians are dedicated to intersectional critical analysis that have to do with these factors. I'm not going to name them. You can see them on the slide. There are many that work in interreligious and comparative analysis, mutual learning across religious boundaries. I don't think it's an accident. Many comparative theologians are working with constructive methodologies, the sense of holy envy. That's perhaps something we can learn from another religious tradition. There's a marker that has to do with resisting Christian triumphalism and supersessionism, an awareness of the history of Christian anti-Semitism, and the way in which it's very easy to just repeat that without necessarily having negative intentions. But there is a lot to be said about that, and how Christian theologies have formed and articulate markers of Christian identity that have a built-in tendency for supersessionism. And here are my examples, which I'm not going to elaborate now. The constructive theologies are also committed to lifting up indigenous wisdom and eco-theologies, given the colonial history and complicity of Christian missions in destroying indigenous cultures. This is one of the important things, to try to bring these voices to the forefront as we confront challenges of climate change. It's generally involved in decolonizing theology. So not only kind of as a societal movement, but primarily also to look at what are the ways in which our images for God have a tendency to be mapped on imperial ideals of power, and how can we critique these and find other ways of talking about divine power that isn't just always mapped on imperial notions of power. It's the one typo I didn't catch: interdisciplinary genres and styles. There are lots of ways in which theological expression happens. So there's an openness to that. And then just quickly, I think this is the last slide about where to. The next steps would be, after this volume, we wanted this volume to kind of function as a way in which allows people to read themselves into the work of constructive theology, understand what the term really wants to say, and find ways in which that might be inviting people into that work across denominational, ecumenical, and geographical boundaries. I'm just going to quickly then show the this book is in a series of publications that I'm co-editing, called Rethinking Theologies, Constructing Alternatives, which is sort of our attempt to broaden the conversation on constructive theology. And those are the books that have been published already. MF's own Jan Olaf Henriksen as one of the first people published in this series on helping us rethink constructive theology, also as having to do with practices. And that is the end of my presentation. Maybe I don't know if I should keep it up or not, but then I'm open to questions or comments.